Hi, I'm Scott Olinger in the Department of Theater and Dance here at Cornell, and I'm here to give you a little bit of context before you jump into Fun Home on graphic novels. So let's jump into that. So let's start with what the term graphic novel refers to. The dictionary refers to it as a story that is presented in comic strip format and published as a book. I think most of us probably have a good sense of what a comic strip format looks like when we think about Sunday comics. Scott McCloud wrote a book called Understanding Comics. Scott is a comic artist himself, and he wanted to try and take a more serious look at how comics create meaning and what techniques they use. It's one of the first serious academic attempts to understand how comics create meaning. And he comes up with a definition that says juxtaposed or adjacent, side-by-side, pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. Okay. So is there a difference between comics and graphic novels? So traditionally, the distinction is that graphic novels are typically long format stories, right? While comics tend to be shorter and serialized. A good example of this is to think about how film tells one large story over several hours, and television tends to be episodic and tell shorter stories in 30-minute or 60-minute segments. Most writers would argue that the distinctions over content are relatively arbitrary. It's a sort of old-fashioned notion that comics are for kids and that graphic novels deal with serious subject matter. There are plenty of serialized comics that deal with very serious subject matter, and there are graphic novels that are pretty lightweight. Alan Moore, who is best known for creating Watchmen, From Hell, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, argues that the term graphic novel is simply a marketing term and carries little to no meaning. He said it came to mean an expensive comic book when publishers just began to collect serialized stories and bundling them together to charge more. One important note is that this specifically is referred to as a trade paperback sometimes rather than a graphic novel. And here's an example of that. So what you're seeing on the left side of the screen are the first 6 issues of Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead, which has turned into an entire franchise for AMC. And what you're seeing on the right is what's called the trade paperback, which collects all the 6 first issues and puts them into one compilation volume. So that would be called a trade paperback specifically rather than a graphic novel. Although some publishers started doing this. They would just take the last 6 issues of X-Men or Superman, they would publish it together and call it a graphic novel in order to be able to sell it for more money, or just to republish it and make money again on issues they had already sold. And that's what Alan Moore is reacting against when he says that. So here's another example. So in terms of distinction of terms, we say that Joyce's Ulysses and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight are both novels, although it's generally accepted that they're not equal in terms of their intention and their impact, right? So here's a little bit of a timeline of the development of the graphic novel in the West. And I say that specifically because this is entirely Western-centric. The graphic novel evolved very differently and has been a respected art form for a much longer time in Asia and Japan in particular. The term graphic novel first appears in 1964 by Richard Kyle, who is reviewing European and East Asian comics. It doesn't really become popular until Will Eisner's book, A Contract with God, that was published in 1978. This is when the term really started to gain traction. Eisner was known for writing the popular comic The Spirit in the 1950s, but he really had a passion to bring serious literary content, in his words, to what was seen as a soft or inconsequential medium. And he finally succeeded with A Contract with God, which told stories from a poor Jewish tenement in New York. Art Spiegelman and Mouse was probably the next major milestone. Spiegelman interviews his father, a Holocaust survivor, and depicts the Jewish people as mice, with Nazis as cats, the Polish people are pigs, and Americans as dogs. Mouse garnered enough attention that he received multiple film offers, and then he addressed that directly in his comics, openly discussing his guilt in potentially profiting from his people's tragedy. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, and it's still a very well-respected comic, although not without some controversy. Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen are both good examples of the superhero genre coming into the graphic novel phase. Both examine the motives, methods, and psychology of anti-heroes with deep personal flaws and with corrupt governments and public unrest. This is sort of a trope that we see again and again through literature now, especially if you look at there's television series like The Boys on Amazon Prime that really is the result of things like Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. The turn of the century, though, sees a new wave of graphic novels that really begin to explore the medium's potential to tell autobiographical stories with really stunning visual impact. And it also expands rapidly the diversity of published creators. There was a diversity of creators before this, but we start to see them finding publishers who are willing to tell their stories. And one of the first examples of this is Marianne Satrapi's Persepolis, which tells her story of growing up in Iran during the Islamic Revolution. Persepolis received worldwide attention and led to a critically acclaimed animated film adaptation. I'm not going to talk here about Fun Home because you're going to spend a lot of time with that, but I'll note that it's published in 2006, the same time as Jean Luen Yang's American-Born Chinese, that tells three seemingly disconnected stories that eventually collide and grapple really with racist stereotypes, identity, cultural tradition. It wins the Eisner Award, which is named for Will Eisner from A Contract with God. But it also wins a series of other awards that demonstrate how mainstream the medium has become. You see here that Amazon has a list, Time has a list, several major newspapers. We also start to see graphic novels appearing on the New York Times bestselling list. So we're starting to see what an impact that these creations are having in culture or popular culture and widespread media. And the last book that I'm going to point out in this timeline is the autobiography of the late John Lewis, U.S. Congressman and civil rights icon. Lewis and Andrew Aiden tell the story of Lewis's experience in the civil rights movement, including his famous march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. March has received numerous awards, including the Eisner Award and the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. It was the first comic to do so. It got special recognition.